I talk about compassion. And I especially explore the role of compassion in meditation and the role of compassion on growing the brain. And it turns out that a lot of research now, a lot of MRI research has shown that compassion grows the brain the fastest. Compassion grows the neural circuits of well-being faster than any other meditation style. And so you want to really focus on a meditation form that works for you.
Welcome to the world of energy, where science meets spirit. Ancient wisdom merges with cutting-edge knowledge, and the possibilities for a healthier, happier you are endless. I've known Dawson Church for quite some time now, and he is a towering presence in the spiritual world. Not just because he is very tall, and not just because he has an infectious laugh, but he is a serious researcher, and he has brought us some of the most powerful research that we have on brain development, meditation, and what that means for each of us individually. I got the chance to sit down with Dawson and talk about his new book, Spiritual Intelligence, which is incredible, wonderful. If you want to know why meditation works and how it works, how it changes the brain for the better, you're going to really love this interview. It was so much fun, a joyful experience, and I hope that you enjoy it as much as I did. Sit back, get ready to laugh when Dawson laughs, and get ready to learn how you can improve your life in probably the easiest way possible. I hope you enjoy. Welcome, Dawson Church. It is so joyful to be with you today.
Lauren, what a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, and thank you for this book. I read it cover to cover, and I have to say, when I picked it up, because it's not a small book, it's a fairly, it's robust, and I thought, oh wow, okay. And I really ate it up. Like it was kind of a page turner. And so I really appreciated that. And I want to just sort of dive in with why you chose to write this book right now. What was your goal? But also the title is so provocative, Spiritual Intelligence. Most of us know, or many of us, our listeners know about emotional intelligence and have been working towards that. And you're taking it to the next level, spiritual intelligence. So what is spiritual intelligence, and why are you telling us about it now?
Spiritual intelligence is the foundation of happiness for everyone, every human being. And the reason I'm so definitive about saying that is that we have these circuits in our brains that predispose us to connection with something greater than ourselves. And this is a very recent scientific discovery. And we've always known about things like the stress circuit. We mapped the stress circuits and some of the learning and memory circuits going back 100 years in neuroscience. But only in the last few years have we realized that we also have these circuits, which I call the Enlightenment Network, which form the physical substrate through which we connect to something greater than ourselves. And it turns out that a lot of that connection is using the same neural pathways we use to connect with each other. And so one of the 4 circuits I describe in chapter 1 is called the empathy circuit. And what we find in master meditators, people who meditate a lot, people who have a lot of time in nature, monks, mystics, nuns, we find that the empathy circuit is highly, highly active. And that circuit mediates joy, gratitude, optimism, all of these other positive emotions. So even though this is part of our brain that is really wired to help us connect with something greater than ourselves, it also helps us connect with nature, with each other, and other supports of ways of being in the world and feeling that sense of oneness that really benefit us and also make us a lot happier than isolation and separateness do. So why I feel that spiritual intelligence is so valuable is it helps us connect. initially connect with each other, eventually connect with cosmic consciousness, and a byproduct, connect with ourselves, love our bodies, love our lives, love the people around us. And that makes a massive difference to our happiness levels and to our health. So that's just one of a lot of good reasons to pay attention to spiritual intelligence.
It's so beautiful and so powerful, and you give so many stories, and obviously the science is so robust here. One of the things that I particularly loved as a yoga teacher is you got to the point in the book where it's sort of like this is yoga, and this is the science behind it, and so it really was, an affirmation to me. And then you also divided things up because you kind of talked about religion and spirituality with people following a particular path or a guru, or that, and that is kind of can take you away from this spiritual intelligence that you're talking about. So maybe talk a little bit about that and those pitfalls.
Yeah, and it is interesting to see culturally over the last few generations how there's been this large movement away from formal religion. And like if you go back 200 years, everyone went to church. If you go back 1,000 years, actually in the Middle Ages in most of Europe, it was illegal to not go to church on Sundays. There's actually a government law. You had to go to church on Sundays. Everybody did. It was also a law you had to tithe. And so we've gone from this society and these societies where everybody was at least nominally religious to these numbers right now. In Europe, it's about 22%. In the US, it's about 30%. In most developed countries, it's well below a third of people who have any kind of affiliation with a church. But if you look at what's been happening in terms of people's spiritual experience, there is an enormous migration both away from religion and into spirituality. So, as a yoga teacher, think about the number of people in the yoga class. When I was in the yoga class in college 50 years ago, there were 4 other people there. And now I go to a yoga class at my gym, and there's a massive 1,000 square foot room, and it's like almost standing room only. You can't even get your yoga mat down. So there's been a huge expansion of people have moved towards spirituality, this genuine urge, this yearning of the human heart for something greater than oneself. Over 70% of people doing hatha yoga have altered states and spiritual experiences as a result. An enormous number of people, atheists, agnostics. It's so funny. Read the data on atheists and agnostics. People don't believe in any God, and they're having spiritual experiences. They're having experiences like altered states of consciousness where they suddenly find themselves having an out-of-body experience, or they're in nature and suddenly they're having this experience of awe that brings tears to their eyes. And so this is really the trend of our era. And it's okay that it doesn't involve religion, because it involves the same experience that's at the core of every religion, which I talk about in chapter 4 of Spiritual Intelligence, which is the mystical experience. And regardless of whether you're a Sufi, whether you're a Jew, whether you're a Christian, whether you're a Taoist, whether you're a Hindu, the core of those religions, every religion sprang from some person or group of people having a mystical experience, going beyond the limits of their physical knowing, their physical consciousness, their local awareness, and merging with the all that is, with something greater than themselves. And when they came back, when Moses came back from the Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments, when Jesus came out of the wilderness, when Muhammad came down from his night journey and the angel Gabriel showed him heaven, they came with this vision of joy and perfection and a human state that was attainable by human beings, and they then try to share that mystical experience with their followers. Didn't always go so well, but the mystical experience is the pinnacle of every religion, and now through spirituality, it's totally accessible. We can take people, and I'm saying this based on having done dozens of EEG scans, MRI studies. We're talking about hard brain science over here. We can take people who aren't monks and nuns. We can take people who aren't particularly spiritual or have any kind of practice, and by training them in the same in the core of what it takes to move to those experiences, we can get them there in just a few weeks, sometimes a few days, certainly a year or two. So it is accessible now to people more so than ever before, and they're entering these altered states more than ever before. We have evidence now that about 20 times the number of people today are doing that, are cultivating their spiritual intelligence, as was the case in 1980. So a 20-fold rise in meditators, in people seeking spiritual experience. And this is having radical effects on society. So it's a phenomenon, and you don't have to go and sit in a pew and sing hymns to do it.
I love that. I love that. I love the studies of, like, these changes happening in such a short amount of time. Talk to us a little bit, because this was such a provocative part of it. As a yoga teacher and as someone who studied this and practiced these kind of things for a long time, you equate the ability to, I don't know if achieving spiritual intelligence is quite the right word, but along this pathway and in these changes that you're talking about that are quite profound, and you equate it to weightlifting. In other words, that you need to have, right? And if you want to lift heavy weights, you need to lift heavy weights. And then the more you do that, the bigger your muscles get so that you can then lift more weights. And you give that to say that this idea of meditation and reaching these spiritual realms that you're talking about, that so many people long to reach, is really very systematic. It doesn't have to be, it's sort of talking what you're just saying, it doesn't have to be taking place in a temple or even, outside in nature where a lot of people do feel their spiritual connections. But you're saying that we need to actually have the musculature in our brains, that this is a very physical thing. This is not as the physical need that you have to get to the spiritual place. So I'd never really seen that before. This is a new concept. So talk to us a little bit about the weightlifting of the brain.
It's a very new concept. And in fact, when I began writing the book in 2019, I was focused very much on spirituality and on mystical experiences. And I didn't realize until I read the science. And for each of my books, I read upwards of 400 scientific studies and report them in the book, but in a really digestible form. They're not geeky books. They're not sciencey books. I mean, they're based on hard science, but I try and provide analogies that make these scientific facts come to life for people. And so I look for a way of making it clear this remarkable breakthrough in neuroscience that shows that these so-called spiritual states, they're definitely spiritual in terms of experiential states. They're mystical experiences. They're experiences of letting go and moving above, transcending our local physical awareness and moving into these elevated states of consciousness, which are incredibly blissful. They're incredibly joyful. In fact, I also use some of the Sanskrit words for joy, because in Sanskrit, there are words for the joy you experience in those states. We don't even have words for how happy that is in English. So I have to go to Sanskrit words like ananda, which is utter bliss, or vishoka, sorrowless joy, which you find in the ancient yogic texts. So that was a big surprise to me to discover how physiologically based these states are. And I use the analogy of weightlifting. And when I had a goal years ago of bench pressing 200 pounds. And so I would go to the gym every 2 or 3 days. I would lay on the bench press. I would work out my deltoids, biceps, triceps. And I had a goal, very, very clear goal, bench press 200 pounds. I had an affirmation, was on my vision board. I had belief, so I was recruiting the placebo effect. I had all of the right stuff, all of the belief, all of the inner and mindset tools for bench pressing 200 pounds. But I could not bench press 200 pounds, even with all those tools, because I didn't have enough muscle fibers in my arm. And if you start to read the data, you realize that the average American male has 12-inch biceps, and I had 12-inch biceps. You need about 13-inch biceps to bench press 200 pounds, and all the belief in the world won't get you there without enough muscle fibers. And so I use that as an example at the start of chapter 2 to illustrate just how you know it's obvious you have to work out your muscles in order to help them get bigger, and then eventually you can do things. So eventually, after many, many months of working out in the gym, building up those biceps to 13 inches, finally the day arrived when I could bench press 200 pounds. And spiritual intelligence is a lot like that, surprisingly like that. If we just practice, we add neurons, because we all know the old saying that neurons that fire together wire together. And you keep on firing certain ones, certain neurons of empathy and compassion and awe and kindness and calm spiritual states. And eventually those circuits get bigger and bigger and bigger in your brain, way faster than your muscles do. So we did one randomized controlled trial. I did this with some colleagues of mine at Bond University in Australia. And we we divided them into two groups. One group got a placebo, mindful breathing. One group got a science-based method I developed called eco meditation. And so then we measured their brain volume in an MRI. We then sent them off to do one of those two things for a month, brought them back after a month. And we found when we got them back in the lab and did a second MRI after 30 days, their brains had changed physically, anatomically, structurally, and functionally. And this is an amazing thing. It'd be like, me deciding to bench press 200 pounds, and 30 days later, bingo, I can do it. That's how quickly our neurons grow. That's how much more quickly they grow in certain parts of the brain than our muscles grow in our arms. So that was the big surprise to me, is that you just have to work out these neurons, and they have to get big enough. These neural bundles have to get large enough to be able to 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 accommodate the information flows of these states like Vishoka and Ananda. And when you do that, you reach a tipping point after a while when suddenly, bingo, you can just enter those states immediately. In the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali calls this samadhi, the state of complete focused attention, joy, where you're in this elevated state. And you can just sit down after a while and go right into samadhi. And we found that after 30 days, only a month, these people's brains had changed dramatically in the whole way they worked. So the good news is that does it take work and effort to develop those circuits? Absolutely. Does it take 10,000 hours? Definitely not. Does it take going into a monastery and taking vows and giving up, meat, sex, laughter, alcohol, coffee? None of the above. You can do all those things and still be developing those brain circuits and entering those elevated states. So I have lots of stories of people who just do this. And I recommend people just practice eco meditation for 30 days, do that same thing we showed in that study, and literally your brain will change. You will start to feel better. I've done this with people now thousands of times in dozens of locations, and they can just feel the change in their bodies. You feel yourself calming down, you feel stress releasing, your gut feels better. The whole body starts to come into a great new level of homeostasis, and then you feel wonderful after doing this. That then releases all these neurotransmitters in your brain, like anandamide, serotonin, dopamine, nitric oxide, beta endorphins, and you feel wonderful as your brain is flooded with these neurochemicals. And then you feel so good, you're motivated to do it again. And many of those, like dopamine, they're going to actually stimulate that neural growth. So your brain is going to change. And what we find in people who meditate a lot for a long time, like Tibetan monks, their brains are changing radically over the course of that time. But for the ordinary person, just 1 month is all it takes to have substantial brain change. And then you open yourself to those mystical experiences of spiritual intelligence by developing that brain hardware. So that's the big message of the book, is that spiritual intelligence is hardware based. You have to do stuff to build the neural pathways. But when you do, you have elevated experiences. You get dramatically happier for a start. And then it doesn't take very long to achieve that kind of state.
I love that. As somebody that likes shortcuts, it
Yeah.
does. It sort of does feel like that. Okay, so that branched out into three questions in my mind. The first is just very detail oriented. So I love at the end of each chapter, you give tons of extra bonuses and including meditations and all of this so that people can really just dive in and start to do the work that you are talking about. So it's not just theoretical, you're giving them the actual tools to do it. So this is a question, and I did a teeny bit of research, but I know you've done more, so you're going to guide me to this. The eco meditation, one of the first things that you guide is to drop the tongue to the floor of the mouth. Everything that I've ever learned, ever studied, and then when I started to do some research, you know where I'm going, but let me ask the question for the audience. Everything that I've ever learned or studied, and I've worked with physios and all kind of people, tongue specialists, two different tongue specialists. The tongue needs to rest on the roof of the mouth. That's where it's naturally meant to be. That's how you connect to the vagus nerve. That's how you connect the micro orbit that circles the body. And that if the tongue rests on the floor of the mouth, it affects the whole nervous system, cause an increase in heart rate, respiratory. It brings you into the sympathetic nervous system. So all of these things, not what you want, and yet you're telling us that we want to put the tongue on the floor. I couldn't find anything that corroborated that. Go.
Yeah, I remember being in yoga class when I was in college at 18, and they said, Put your tongue on the roof of your mouth." And the theory in acupuncture is that we have the governing meridian that runs all up way up our back, over the top of our head, down middle of our nose, ends in our upper lip, and then we have the conception vessel, central meridian, which runs all the way up the front as the lower lip. And when you raise the tongue and have it on the roof of the mouth, it connects the two. So that's acupuncture theory. So I learned that as well. And then somewhere along the line, I heard a Qigong master talk about letting your tongue rest on the floor of your mouth. And so I simply, when I was trying to figure out how to build eco meditation, I took a look at the literature. And there turned out to be studies on this, both studies of primates and human studies, what happens when your tongue is raised and when your tongue is lowered. And what happens when you lower your tongue, the research shows, is that there is a nerve called the hypoglossal nerve that is in your tongue, has two branches, runs into this nerve complex at the back of the skull and connects with the vagus nerve. And when you relax that hypoglossal, the tongue and that hypoglossal nerve, it sends a relaxation signal to the vagus nerve. And of course, the vagus nerve connects with every major organ system. And so people relax right away when they relax their tongue on the floor of the mouth. Now, you want to raise your tongue to the roof of your mouth when you want to energize yourself. So in energy medicine or acupuncture terms, it's energizing to connect the central and governing meridians with your tongue. And that's why in most yoga classes or most Qigong classes, they'll talk about having your tongue connect your two major meridians that way. But what we found in physiological studies is that when you relax the tongue and stimulate that hypoglossal nerve to relax, that sends a signal to the vagus nerve that all is well. When we are stressed, when we are emotionally triggered, emotionally aroused, our tongue is usually rigid on the roof of our mouth. People who are stressed, their tongue is rigid. If you have somebody relax their tongue, in fact, let's just do a real really cool 1-minute experiment with everyone listening right now. Okay, so relax your tongue on the floor of your mouth. It's hard to do because we're used to keeping our tongue rigid, but relax your tongue, just kind of let your jaw drop and oh, no, 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 no. I promise I won't let mine get too loose because otherwise I couldn't talk. But relax your tongue. And now think about something or someone from the last 2 weeks that was annoying in your life. Somebody at work, somebody at home, a neighbor. And so keep your tongue relaxed and think about this event and try and get mad at them. Try and get emotionally triggered, but keep your tongue relaxed. And you will find to your amazement, you can't do it. You just can't get emotionally aroused. You can't get emotionally triggered. why your tongue is relaxed, because you're sending a signal to your vagus nerve that there's no danger right now. If you were in danger, your body starts to tense up, including your tongue. When you relax your tongue, you're sending a signal that everything's okay, that there's no actual danger right now. So just try that experiment, and it's a lot of fun to do that. And it's a lot of this is counterproductive. Another piece that's counterproductive about eco meditation is I have a dear friend, Roland McCratey, who is the research director at HeartMath. And I remember in 2007, a long time ago, I was talking to Roland. Roland is a iconoclast, and he is not very flattering about meditators like me. He said, Dawson, most meditation is dissociation. And
No, untrue on
so
that.
there's an element of truth to that. And he said that
Yeah.
when HeartMath tests meditators who are in heart coherence, so they bring themselves into heart coherence, maybe using HeartMath's tools, then they meditate, they drop out of heart coherence. I said, I don't think so, Roland. Surely meditation should encourage and meditation should produce heart coherence. He said it doesn't. So I went home from the conference I was at, talking to him about this. I went home, and I had a housemate at the time, a housemate who was a long-term deep meditator. Name was Jeff Anderson. And I hooked Jeff up to an EEG and a heart rate variability monitor. And I said, I'll meditate, Jeff. He went into this beautiful deep meditation, but he dropped out of heart coherence right away. And so what I do in eco meditation is I have you use a breathing rhythm that puts you into heart coherence and keeps you there all the way through. So a lot of these things, like the tongue on the floor of your mouth, is counterintuitive. A lot of things like the breathing rhythm is designed to keep you in heart coherence, and so you won't drop out when you meditate. And this produces a vastly different meditative experience. People who can't meditate, who say, Dawson, maybe look at our website, ecomeditation.com, look at the testimonials there, the people who say, I've never been able to meditate in my whole life. In all the meditation classes I've taken, all the monasteries I've visited, and courses I've done, and books I've read, and then they do this once, and boom, they're there. So it's very mechanical. It's not very spiritual. It's just kind of, relaxing certain muscles, doing the breathing rhythm, but suddenly you're just there. And then when you get there, it feels really good. You become highly motivated to go there again. So we find people tend to learn eco meditation. If they do it for 30 days, they're unlikely to ever stop. One woman said to me, I took the 30-day challenge, did it for a whole month. I said to her, and what day are you on now? She said, I'm on day 156. It's like, yeah, that's what happens, is you just get addicted to all that serotonin and dopamine and oxytocin, and you never want to stop. So people tend to experience it the first time with these mechanical steps and then perpetuate it because the body wants to feel good, and that's a sure way to getting there.
I love that. And I've done eco meditation and I do really like it for that very reason. I really like the mechanicalness of it. I don't find it to be mechanical once I'm doing it, but I see what it's definitely very do this, do this, do this. The breathing, I actually did find corroboration for that. James Nestor in his book Breath talks about the perfect breath is 5.5. 6 is, it's negotiable. Is 5.5 and 6 is the same thing. And so bringing you into heart coherence. I'd love to see the tongue studies, and maybe you could send us some of that and we can include that in the show notes here.
Sure.
Because I do think it's important for people to know, because for years I thought your tongue was meant to be on the bottom of the mouth, and I trained myself to do that. And then I started working with a speech therapist and a mouth practitioner. That was not her technical name. And really the tongue is meant to be relaxed on the roof of the mouth. And if you keep the tongue on the floor of the mouth, it leads to all kinds of issues, breathing challenges, speech issues, facial structure, all kinds of things that we don't want. So this is just something that we're doing for this meditation. And I'd love just personally to see that research because, as I said, I haven't been able to find it. I'm not disputing that you have it, because I know the kind of researcher that you are. Um, so back to to where you get to, because this again was my I'm a wood element. I think you're probably a metal element, primary. And one of the things that I read when we talked about the finders, sorry, you writing about the finders as opposed to the seekers, right? All the spiritual seekers, but everyone's just always seeking, seeking, seeking. And you're saying, well, we need to find, and this is how you get to the finding. And I was, oh, that's great. I love that. Again, something new I haven't heard before. And I liked each of the locations, except then when we got to location 4. And I'm reading this and I'm thinking, I don't want to be in location 4. If this is the finding, I don't want to be there. Here's some of the things that happen when you're reaching these peak stages continuously. Um, you have a disappearance of agency, no sense of agency or ability to make decisions. Disappearance of emotion, the experience of emotion disappears. Memory deficits. Finders in location 4 have an inability to recall schedule events. So I can see that on the one hand, this would be an ecstatic experience where you're just out of time and mind. But it doesn't seem to me that this is a place that you could sustain unless you are living in a monastery where everyone is taking care of everything else and you don't have to use your emotions as information or know that you have an appointment at 3 o'clock. So talk to me about my very pushing away at this point. I'm like, no, I don't want that. Talk to me about that.
So the locations are really interesting, and they were described by my friend Jeffrey Martin in his book called The Finders. And what he was doing for decades, actually about 20 years, is he was interviewing people who'd crossed the boundary between seeker and finder. And they'd been seekers of spirituality, seekers of peak state, seekers of enlightenment, often for many years, often for decades. And then one day, they built up those biceps to 13 inches, built up those neural bundles big enough, and boom. That's chapter 3, is called the tipping point. When you reach the tipping point, you add the last neuron. And suddenly you can hit Ananda, in these states of just complete bliss. So Jeffrey he interviewed these people, described the states that they're in. And he called them locations, location 1, location 2, location 3, location 4. Also in that chapter 4 of Spiritual Intelligence, the awakened experience, I want to give people a picture of what it looks like, what it feels like, what it is like inside the skull of a person who's become finder, who has crossed the tipping point, who's had that enlightenment, awakening experience, and is now there, at least part of the time. And I don't usually call it enlightenment, because I think of enlightenment as being the Buddha, Jesus, people who cross the tipping point and are there all the time. Most of us schmucks like me, we get there every morning meditation, and then, we do stuff during the day that's not so bright or enlightened, and we have to go back and meditate the next day. So that's awakening. But we live generally awakened lives, and a lot more people than used to, are living generally awakened lives. They haven't necessarily reached the enlightenment of a Buddha, but they are living consciously, they're living mindfully, they're living wonderful lives as a result of this. And those are the finders. And so Jeffrey calls them locations. And he found that when they hit the tipping point, became a finder, that they wound up in one of 4 places, which he calls location 1, 2, 3, and 4. I tie these back in spiritual intelligence to the 4 basic forms of samadhi described by Patanjali and Vyasa in the Yoga Sutras thousands of years ago. So these states have been understood by mystics for a great many millennia. And I like the descriptions provided in Patanjali. And again, those are Vitarka Samadhi, Vichara Samadhi, Ananda Samadhi, Asmita Samadhi. Those are the 4 states that correspond very closely to the 4 locations. And so location 3 is really interesting. Location 3 is the happy state, the happy monk, the happy meditator. You're living in total absolute bliss, and that has many positive characteristics and qualities to it. Location 4 is quite different. In location 4, you feel as though you're a leaf blowing in the cosmic wind. You may lose all motivation. And Jeffrey says for 2 years, I found that people who enter location 4 or asmita samadhi in Patanjali's terms often lose most motivation for the rest of their lives. And they might have been there for several years and be very content with the way things are. But for me, when I'm in that location or in that state, it's wonderful. Like, I mean, at times it's like my children sometimes will kid me, because I drive really old cars. I haven't bothered, buying a new car for more than a decade. And it's like, Danny, why'd you trade in the old clunker and get something new? It's like, I don't have any motivation to do it. I'm just so happy with my ancient car. I just can't. It's like, why am I so happy with my ancient body and my ancient car and my ancient, I mean, your motivation, your sense of trying to attain things really degrades. But the flip side is you're incredibly content with things exactly the way they are, even when they look really bad. And when you get sick, for example, and I've had some periods when I was sick or I needed an operation or something, and yet you're completely accepting of your body as it ages. Sometimes it's broken down. You're accepting of your life when you're doing really well, when you're not. People around you, you're really accepting of them as well. And so it has immense gifts to have that motivation diminish or go away. Memory deficits, it's like you really aren't that driven anymore. You just basically are drifting on the stream of life. And you feel as though you're in touch with the cosmic pulse of life. And you don't need to go make things happen all the time. You just can go with the flow, go with the river, and you trust the river 100%. So you just, even when it does lead you to sickness or old age or ultimately death. I mean, in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, the whole perspective of those ancient yogis was every yogic practice in all 195 sutras of the Yoga Sutras is leading you to one experience, and that is a conscious death. And so that is where you move to in location 4, where even if you die, it's not that you don't care whether you live or die, but you're completely okay with how things are, even if that includes sickness, and eventually for all of us, it will include the death of the physical body. And so these yogic practices have you move toward the point where you can have a conscious and mindful death as well. So it is funky. There are all those memory deficits and things. Like when I hit location 4, my publicist realized I was forgetting interviews and I was forgetting deadlines. And so now she sends my wife, who definitely is much more practical than I am, an email every Thursday or Friday and says, these are Dawson's appointments for next week. Make sure he looks at his calendar. So you find location 4 finders develop coping mechanisms. Like I have my publicist send me that email every Friday and remind me. And so it is a weird state. The other realization, though, is that when we are in location 4, we have the ability, and we certainly are smart to cultivate the ability to move into location 3, 2, and 1, because you certainly cannot run a meeting or change a baby's diaper or relate to the people around you or parent or run a team in location 4. You have to move back into location 1 or 2, ideally. And so I do that. And Jeffrey calls this location fluidity. So sometimes you're in asmita samadhi, other times you move back into vichara samadhi when you have to run a meeting. So you can run it effectively, so you can be an inspiring leader, so you can be practical, so you can, pay your taxes and fill your car tank with gas and go to the grocery store. So you can't do all that in location 4. So it's wonderful to have these ecstatic states where in this mystical realm, and then it's very powerful to have location fluidity, to move back into the ability to deal with ordinary life, because we have to do that. We aren't living behind the walls of a monastery where we can drift off and have someone else shove a bowl of rice under our door each day to keep us alive. I would have to deal with the real world that's approached to deal with the real world. I mean, we're here, we're in bodies for a purpose. We're not here to deny the body. The old mystics of the 1000 AD, and whether in India or whether in the West, they talk about denying the body, mortifying the flesh. The Shankara calls it this bag of filth. That's what he calls the body, this great Indian sage of 600 AD that revitalized Hinduism. And they really had a highly negative view of the body, the medieval mystics and people in that era. And that's just not helpful now. We have a body. We need to love the body. We need to rejoice in the body. My wife and I put on the Beach Boys last night and spent an hour dancing. So yeah,
Nice.
it's, you want to enjoy being here rather than just drifting off into this mystical state and disappearing into samadhi. Enjoy your physical life. Enjoy that glass of wine. Enjoy that avocado. Enjoy that ice cream.
Hmm.
That's why I have a body
Hmm.
as well as the ability to move, and using spiritual intelligence to move into those higher states.
Right, right. And I think that's that denial of the body and historically in ancient times was a highly masculine endeavor. I think the ancient women mystics were very much more the celebratory uh, dance into the Beach Boys back 5,000 years ago. Um, okay, I've got one more sort of technical question before I really want to go into the hope for the future that you bring in this book. But I do have a technical question, and sorry for all you listeners that aren't like into these little minutia details, but I am. Okay, on page 150, you talk about the awakened mind, and you give us all of these talking about the gamma, beta, delta, all the brainwave frequencies and what they mean and how they change whether we're in ordinary consciousness, stress, or the awakened mind pattern. But when I look at the brainwaves for the ordinary consciousness and I see what you wrote about them, there's quite a lot of delta going on, but you don't mention that at all. And so I was just a little confused by that because there seems to just be kind of, you talk about, the beta and the theta and gamma, and that there's so many betas leaving up to gamma and what that does to the brain. And I'll let you explain all of that. But there is a lot of delta in both hemispheres of the brain. And that's not even mentioned at all there until we get to the awakened mind and you talk about the delta that then lifts us up into theta, which is such a beautiful mind state to be in. So what if we have all that delta already in just ordinary consciousness, why doesn't that also lift us up into theta? And I don't know if you know the charts that I'm referring to right there. I don't
Yes.
know if can you see those? So you can see right here there's all this delta.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. And delta is the slowest brain wave. And so they go up in speed up to the highest brain wave of gamma. That delta is the slowest brain wave. And the time when your brain is most in delta is deep sleep. In deep sleep, everything else vanishes and all the other brain waves disappear. And you're almost entirely in delta, except for the very brief periods every hour or so when your brain speeds up a little bit into theta and you have rapid eye movement, dreams, vivid dreams, and then it drops back down into delta after a few minutes. So it's the wave of sleep. And what happens in delta is pruning during sleep. Your brain is pruning old unused neural connections. So it doesn't just build new neurons. After 2 or 3 weeks of not using a circuit, it starts to disintegrate the old ones. And that's where delta is really useful, why deep sleep and high quality deep sleep is so incredibly important for feeling good. If you don't, all that junk doesn't get cleared out of the brain and it builds up and you start to have brain problems and then cognitive problems as well. So delta is super important brainwave. During waking life, there's a number of corollaries. One is that people who are highly psychic have lots of delta. People who really are aware of their circumstances around them, who are aware of their environments, who love environmental awareness, what's going on around me, have delta. And then traumatized people have lots of delta because they had to be very aware when they were young, when they were little. They had to be super aware of when daddy comes home from work drunk or mommy gets into a rage. I mean, they had to be hyper aware, hyper vigilant. And so they grew up with large delta and alpha and keep large delta when they are adults, larger than normal. So, very, very important way. In waking consciousness, we have a fair amount of delta, and the more we're tuning in to our environment, the more delta we're going to have. So, when, for example, we want to sense a room, you walk into a room, you're wondering what kind of reception you get. Are these strangers? Are there any friends of mine there? You're going to see your delta go way out as you're intuitively reading the room. Also, you're going to couple with the delta of other people. Like I know when my wife and I hug each other, which we do we give each other very, very long hugs. And everyone in our family does that, kids and grandkids. And so we know that the delta is going to be a coupled way as well with other people's delta who are around us. And again, that's that psychic connection, that subconscious and unconscious ability to really relate to each other. So we do have a fair amount of delta in normal wakeful life, just as we sense our environment, sense other people, sense what we're reading, what we're experiencing. And then when we're under stress, delta disappears. So our delta shrinks a lot and beta grows. And that's that second illustration there on page 150 of shrunken delta. You'll see when beta blossoms out, when we get really stressed, we have very, very, very little delta or theta or alpha, because it's all the brain's energy flows are commandeered, are subverted by the high beta of stress. And then again, when we calm down, we'll drop back into more alpha, then theta and delta. So it's a dynamic picture. And when you watch this on those are just static images in the book, but you actually watch this on a recording and you'll see people's brainwave shifting just very, very quickly. Tell them to think a stressful thought, and immediately beta just goes out in a nanosecond and delta shrinks. Tell them to, if they start to do eco meditation, for example, they'll drop completely out of that high beta. They'll have a ton of alpha, and they'll have a very wide delta footprint, and then that'll trigger a big surge of gamma. So you'll see all these pleasure and integration waves of gamma popping up at the top. So as we change our minds, our brain waves change dramatically, and we're doing this all through conscious choice. If I decide to relax my body and take a break, suddenly my brain waves are changing. That's changing the patterns of neural firing. If I'm stressed, that's changing the patterns of neural firing. It's then triggering all these changes in my body. There are amazing stories of people who did this. Some people who, like I was having some people do eco meditation recently. They were doing all the different steps of eco meditation, and in about 5 minutes, they were much calmer. And then one lady said, gee, my back pain was like a 7 out of 10, and it's gone down to a 0. And all she did was relax. She's changing the information flows in her brain consciously. Suddenly, her neurotransmitters and hormones change. So that's why, again, we find with people in location 1, 2, 3, or 4, or Vitarka, Vichara, Ananda, and Asmita Samadhi, in Samadhi, their perception of pain goes way, way, way down. They just have less physical pain. Their bodies regulate dramatically once they are hitting these states. And it's the amazing thing is we have the ability to change our consciousness, and just changing our thoughts is able to produce all these changes, at first in brain waves, then in hormones, neurotransmitters, and very, very quickly in the actual structure of our brains and nervous system. So it's all under our conscious control. And that's the other big positive message of the book. We can just develop this spiritual intelligence ability and cultivate it in just a few weeks, and we start to feel dramatically better. Our bodies feel better. Our aging slows way down. And in one study just published, there's a huge 11,000 person multi-year study by the VA. They found that the difference in lifespan between people who are reducing their stress physiologically and emotionally and making healthy choices, and those that are not doing the opposite, those who are making unhealthy choices, the difference in lifespan between the two groups was 24 years on average. So it really shows up in your longevity if you're making those wise choices.
Wow, wow. Wow, that's amazing. 24 years. I love that all of the downstream effects of starting and continuing a meditation practice, even things such as, and you have studies in here, Alzheimer's, um, studies of people kind of recovering memory and things like that. I mean, that's a huge issue in the world today. So I think that's so powerful that we do have that capacity to build the muscle, build the hardware that, as you call it, in the brain to then carry the software of joy, of compassion, and that actually compassion builds things even faster. So there's all of these personal benefits that we accrue from starting these practices or continuing and deepening these practices, and going from seeking to finding and to really achieving that. But then you take it even further, that this is going to have a global impact. And when I get to that section of the book, it becomes very poetic. There's so many paragraphs that start with expect this, expect all of this goodness to come in every human endeavor on the planet. And so I want that. I dream of that. I hope for that. You also give us lots of studies showing that despite what we might be feeling or seeing about what's going on in the world today, things actually have categorically improved for most people on the planet in the last 500, 150 years. And yet, we are at a very, what a lot of people are calling the tipping point in the world globally, with climate crises, with political crises. And I wonder, there's the promise that you offer if we do these practices. And so I want to talk about that, but I also want you to talk about it in light of the people that need to be doing these practices and increasing their compassion and their sense of cohesion and connectivity to everyone else, so that we want everyone's well-being. The people that are making the decisions that are so harrowing to the planet, to the political systems, to the well-being of many, many people, just in our country alone, but all over the world. This sort of descent into some kind of, it feels like a descent into madness. How do we get this work to those people? Or do we not even need to, and critical mass can be reached by all of the other people seeking, and that therefore that they'll be affected by it anyway? A little Rupert Sheldrake action going on there. So help us see this incredibly optimistic end of the book that you have.
Yeah, and in the last chapter of Spiritual Intelligence, I do use that phrase, expect to see, and I then say what I expect to see happening in the next few decades in law, education, in medicine, healthcare, psychology, all these fields of human endeavor, the arts. What's going to happen as spiritual intelligence becomes part of our culture, part of our world? But in chapter 6, I talk about compassion. And I especially explore the role of compassion in meditation and the role of compassion on growing the brain. And it turns out that a lot of research now, a lot of MRI research has shown that compassion grows the brain the fastest. Compassion grows the neural circuits of well-being faster than any other meditation style. And so you want to really focus on a meditation form that works for you, but that integrates an element of compassion in there. And so it just grows the brain, just grows that set of brain circuits, grows those enlightenment networks much faster if you incorporate compassion into your practice. And when I wrote my previous book, Bliss Brain, at the end of the book, I said, I looked at the research that shows that the number of meditators in the US, according to the CDC, has increased 20-fold in the last 45 years. That's not 20%, that's 20 times. For every one meditator in 1980, in the US and in developed countries, there are now 20. So the number was about 1% of the population in 1980. Today it's 20%. And we know that compassion and meditation change the brain. We know that the number of people meditating has risen 20-fold. Therefore, there must be evidence of that. There should be evidence of that in society, in the way we run our society, and also in the structure of the human brain. So I made the very bold prediction in Bliss Brain in 2020 that we would be seeing large-scale change in the anatomy of the human brain in our lifetimes. And that was a pretty far-fetched concept back in 2020. And just in time for spiritual intelligence, a major study was published showing that they compared a group of people who were born clustered in around 1930 with a second group born around 1970. And they found that that prediction I'd made all those years ago actually was showing up now in the structure of the human brain. The newer brains, people born in 1970, had 15% greater surface area and almost 7% greater volume than the earlier cohort. And it was concentrated in the areas that have to do with emotion regulation, with executive control, and with memory and learning. And so we're seeing now growth in the very areas we associate with meditation in the brains of people being born in later cohorts. So this means that it's likely that the human brain is evolving now very, very quickly. We're stimulating the evolution of our own brains, and then we're producing a more compassionate world for our children. And the way I demonstrate this showing up in society is I compare phenomena from the 1700s and 1800s, like the abolition of slavery, like giving women the vote. And those reforms happened very, very quickly by historical standards, both in about 50 to 100 years. I mean, slavery was everywhere in 1800. Slavery was nowhere in 1900. Women getting the vote was nowhere in 1850. It was everywhere by 1920. So these things changed really quickly. Then I talk about things happening today. Gay marriage, legalization of marijuana, the intolerance of bullying, homeless shelters, the intolerance for domestic violence and abuse. When I was growing up, it wasn't that long ago, it was the 50s and 60s, and domestic abuse was bullying. All these things were just endemic in society, and no one said a darn thing about them. You knew that Mr. Jones was beating his wife on Friday nights after getting back from the pub drunk, and no one said a thing about it. You knew that Tommy was getting hurt by his mother at his house, and no one people said that's the family's responsibility. So we're changing now really, really quickly. And I have a list at the end of the book of all the ways in which we become much more compassionate very, very quickly now. And when I put the whole list together, Lauren, I was absolutely amazed. I'm just flipping through here. This is on page 227. And it just shows the remarkable way society is changing. I mentioned assisted suicide. Again, illegal everywhere, just as long ago as 1995. And now there are many jurisdictions that allow it. Animal rights. When I was a kid, your dog got sick, you had it put down. Now people spend money on having their pets taken care of. We care about how cows are slaughtered. I mean, animal slaughter. There are laws now that weren't in place when I was a kid. Bullying, child protective services, civil rights, clean water access, clean air, the death penalty. The death penalty was everywhere 40 years ago. Now it's hard to find. Disability accommodations, drug legalization, equal pay, equal protection under the law, extreme poverty. Extreme poverty has declined in the U.S. by 90% in my lifetime, 90%. and I'm only on the E's on my list. So there's lots of evidence that society is becoming a lot more compassionate than it used to be. The pace of change is accelerating, and this will produce a much more compassionate world in the future. Do we see that in the headlines? No, we read the headlines and they're all full of this or that act of violence or this really unconscious action by someone in power. Believe me, these are blips on the screen of history, and the big picture data shows this move toward human flourishing.
So do you see, because I see that and I saw those studies and I was very moved by them, and I'm not unaware of what's going on in the world today, which is sort of a global slide backwards, in many of these metrics that you're talking about. And so I wonder, do you see that as just a blip, and do you see that there's the potential for these backward, let's just call them backward looking leaders, because it's really people in leadership positions in many countries around the world, that are backsliding away from all of these protections of women, minorities, and the environment and animals, and all of these things are sliding backwards precipitously at the moment in many places. Do you see that as just an aberration, as a course correction, or as a, the pendulum swings, and is this work the antidote to that? And if so, how do we get it to the people that really need to grow their compassion networks?
You have to zoom out to see the trends. When you zoom into a single year, a single month, or a single news story, you can't see the trends. But if you zoom out to the 10-year perspective or the 50-year or 100-year perspective, then the trends are obvious. One place, for example, is human rights. And you look at human rights since 1950 through today. And we don't find that human progress and improvement in human rights is going up on a nice straight line like that. It's going up and it goes down. There's some terrible times when there is the genocide in Gaza, when there is a genocide in Darfur, the Rwandan genocide. I mean, there are just these terrible things that happen. Cambodia. I mean, there are just these horrendous aberrations from the norm. So it's not like it's a nice straight line, but you look at the trend over 100 years, and it's like very, very striking. Another graph I have in the book in the last chapter is the murder rate. And the murder rate has dropped dramatically in the last 1,000 years. Now, that's, again, a very long period of time. Doesn't mean it dropped a little bit every year. No, it didn't. It spiked some years and then plummeted other years and went up and down. But the trend, when you look at it over 1,000 years, is super clear. Wars between great powers. Again, you see great power wars. We have, of course, the two enormous ones, World War I and World War II. In the 1900s, we've had horrendous ones, the Napoleonic War, the Franco-Prussian War, in the 1800s. So you can, in every epoch, you can find horrendous exceptions to the average. But look at great power wars over 500 or 1,000 years, and they are going down. So when you read the current news story, there's a phrase in news that they use to determine which stories to highlight in the headlines, and that phrase has been around for 100 years, which is, if it bleeds, it leads. The lead story is always the most dramatic one, the one most likely to capture our attention, and yet it's often the one that is counter trend. So the big trends are positive, and the news tends to focus on these little things that are bad and really be blind to all the good that's happening. So I make it a practice to go on websites. And I mentioned a few of them in the book. I go read nice.news and positivenews.com and other news stories, and you find hundreds and then thousands of stories of people being kind and doing good. I will not read a single one of those in the New York Times or see it on Fox News. What I'll find there is all the if it leads, it leads stuff. So we're looking at the world through an incredibly distorted lens by reading the news. We have to step out. So I do that in the last chapter of Spiritual Intelligence, and we find that all the trends are positive. Are they uniformly positive? No. Does that mean we can afford to ignore problems like racial inequality, gender inequality, climate change, animal rights? Absolutely not. We need to be paying attention to all of these things: environmental degradation, corporate greed. All of these are vital issues. Another very good reason to be a mystic out there for an hour or two every morning, and then come right back here, donate, protest, do stuff in the world, because again, the world needs people who are engaged with it. We don't have a world, we don't have the luxury of another planet to go to at this point, despite our fantasies of going off to Mars or someplace. And so we need to make this world work, and that needs highly engaged people, not outraged people losing their emotional balance and descending to the level of conflict that the aggressors have. Wise people who are out there, but like Gandhi, who come back here and make social change. The Martin Luther Kings, the Nelson Mandelas, the Mohandas Gandhis, the Susan B. Antony's. We need people like that who are activists in the world, mystical activists, and they are, again, the ones who are going to create the change. So I'm not preaching for the removal of our psyches into location 4 and going out and hanging out there for the rest of our lives. It's a very nice place to be. I go there every day, but I come back and I run a business and I run a nonprofit. I'm training therapists now in Ukraine because we want to get this work to people in Ukraine. We're offering EFT and eco-meditation to people who are suffering in the wake of school shootings and other terrible disasters. So again, we're highly engaged in the real world, but we also are experiencing those elevated states. And the need right now is for, again, the activist mystic, the person who can reach those states. You don't want to just be the activist and be sucked into the today's headlines. You're going to be miserable if you do that. You want to step back and feel the pulse of life, the pulse of nature that is always there, that cosmic consciousness that is holding the whole of humankind, the whole of evolution, the whole of the universe. Be in touch with that space, but then move back, calibrate to the world we live in right now, which is calling us to action, to change, and practical steps to make things better.
Wow. Activist mystic, mystical activism. That it might be the name of this podcast. Dawson, thank you so much for your inspirational book and this inspirational conversation. I just adore both of them and you as well. And it's just such a pleasure to get to sit with you again and ask these questions and hear your beautiful laugh, because that is a mystical experience as well, very joyful. Thank you so much, Dawson. I really appreciate your time today.
Oh, what a joy, Lauren. Thanks for all your insights, your work. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Alrighty, Energy fans, that's a wrap on another positively charged episode of Energy Works. Lauren, this is the part where we get to use our energy puns.
It's been electrifying, hasn't it, Blaine? We hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have.
If you're feeling amped up and you want to keep your energy flowing, be sure to hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast platform.
And we'd love to hear from you. So please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback helps us continue to deliver content that resonates. So light up our inbox.
And spark a conversation with your friends to tell them about us. And we'll see you next time on Energy Works.